Madam President and distinguished members of the Court, good morning. It is an honor to appear before you on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. It falls to me today to address the circumstances underlying the ongoing irreparable harm that Azerbaijan's actions have been inflicting on the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh for the last 50 days. I turn first to the existence of irreparable prejudice in the present case. The Court, pursuant to Article 41 of its statute, has the power to indicate provisional measures when irreparable prejudice could be caused to rights which are the subject of judicial proceedings, or when the alleged disregard of such rights may entail irreparable consequences. My apologies. In all prior cases concerning possible violations of the CERD, the Court has found rights under Article 5 of the CERD to be of such a nature that prejudice to them is capable of causing irreparable harm. For example, in the case brought by Georgia against Russia under the CERD, the Court held that violations of the right to freedom of movement could cause irreparable harm in situations where the persons concerned are exposed to privation, hardship, anguish, and even danger to life and health. In the case brought by Qatar against the United Arab Emirates under the CERD, the Court found that prejudice can also be considered as irreparable when inter alia, and I quote, individuals are subject to temporary or potentially ongoing separation from their families and suffer from psychological distress, and when students are prevented from taking their exams due to enforced absence. Through the present request for provisional measures, Armenia is seeking to protect rights of ethnic Armenians under Articles 5b, 5d, and 5e, Roman numeral 4, together with those rights arising from the general prohibition of racial discrimination under Article 2. In circumstances where Azerbaijan has put into jeopardy the security of 120,000 people, deprived them of freedom of movement and their rights to be with their families and loved ones, their rights to receive food, medical care, education, heat, and electricity amidst the freezing winter, there is no reason for the Court to revisit its established approach to the nature of the rights under Article 5 of the CERD, or that of the potential prejudice to them. I turn to the final condition for the indication of provisional measures, namely urgency. The Court has made clear that it will indicate provisional measures, quote, only if there is urgency, in the sense that there is a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice, in case there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused before the Court gives its final decision. So what has happened in these 50 days of blockade? And does it meet the requisite urgency for the exercise of the Court's power? Let us recall the essential facts. As the blockade took shape on 12 December 2022, hundreds of people were stranded on the blockaded road in cold winter conditions. Over 1,000 who had been visiting family, attending school or events, or conducting business away from Nagorno-Karabakh were instantly cut off from their homes and families. This included approximately 270 children. At the same time, as Mr. Martin recalled earlier, the daily flow of 400 tons of essential goods into Nagorno-Karabakh immediately came to a halt, as did the transfer of the critically ill to Armenia for urgent medical treatment and scheduled medical examinations. On day 2, amidst freezing winter temperatures, the gas supply was interrupted. As it did last March, Azerbaijan did not allow emergency crews to investigate and make necessary repairs. The interruption persisted for 3 days until, under mounting international pressure, the flow of gas was restored. On day 8, the blockade claimed its first life when a 44-year-old hemodialysis patient in serious condition was not permitted to seek treatment outside Nagorno-Karabakh. On the same day, all non-emergency surgeries in all hospitals in Nagorno-Karabakh were suspended due to the anticipated shortages in medical supplies. By day 10, grocery store shelves had been emptied of fresh food staples. Bakeries were running out of ingredients to make bread. By day 11, pharmacies were running out of antibiotics, blood pressure medication, insulin, and other essential medicines and medical supplies. By day 15, cash shortages led to the imposition of withdrawal limits at banks. On day 23, local authorities decided that due to the impossibility of importing food and essential goods with regularity, state wartime reserves would need to be distributed. On day 28, food shortages led preschools and kindergartens across Nagorno-Karabakh to close their doors. It has now been more than 3 weeks since the youngest children have been out of school. On the same day, the only high-voltage power line connecting Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia was damaged in an apparent act of sabotage. As a result of the blockade, Nagorno-Karabakh technicians were denied access to the site. The electricity supply has not been stable since. By day 36, the transmission of natural gas had fallen to a fraction of its normal flow. According to Nagorno-Karabakh engineers, this suggested that Azerbaijan had intentionally adjusted the valve to reduce supply. On day 37, for the second time during these 50 days, the supply of natural gas was completely cut off around noon local time, only to be restored at 5 p.m. and then cut off again at 9 p.m. That same day, 4 hours of rolling blackouts per day were introduced in order to cope with the dwindling supply of electricity. The electrical grid was already at a reduced capacity due to the downing of the main electrical power line on day 29. Naturally, in the absence of a consistent flow of natural gas, the electrical grid is even more overwhelmed, as people turn to electrical heating sources to cope with the lack of gas. On day 39, all 117 schools in Nagorno-Karabakh were closed indefinitely due to the shortage of gas and electricity supplies, which affected naturally tens of thousands of children. The supply of natural gas remained cut off. On day 40, the gas supply was resumed. To alleviate the pressure on the electricity grid, it was, however, decided to increase rolling blackouts across Nagorno-Karabakh from 4 to 6 hours a day. The same day, a coupon rationing system for essential foodstuff came into effect. On day 41, at around 8 p.m. local time, the gas supply was cut off yet again, marking the 4th time in a little over a month. For the next 3.5 days, the supply of gas was never more than 11% of the usual supply. This trickle of gas was barely enough to fuel ovens in bakeries and provide minimum heat in hospitals. By day 44, grocery stores in Nagorno-Karabakh had been emptied of almost all products. Baby formula became a scarce commodity. By day 45, commercial gas stations across Nagorno-Karabakh had to shut down as the dwindling gas was diverted to healthcare institutions and bread production facilities. On day 46, over 250 tons of humanitarian aid destined for Stepanakert remained in warehouses in Goris, unable to be transported across the blockade. Appeals to the residents of Stepanakert started to appear on social media, calling them to evacuate, which were dismissed by local authorities as an attempt by the intelligence service of Azerbaijan to spread panic among the population. On day 47, local authorities began distributing firewood and wood-burning stoves to residents. The gas supply was partially restored on that day, but supplied only to the residents of Stepanakert, given the demands on the impaired energy system. On day 48, the gas supply was once again cut off. The gas supply appears to have been restored on the eve of this hearing. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, this is where we stood as of 24 hours ago. The situation remains precarious as we enter today, day 50. To see this firsthand, you may find at tab 2 of your judges' folders the English versions of some of the very bulletins that residents of Nagorno-Karabakh receive daily from the local authorities. These bulletins update them on what new cruelty Azerbaijan's actions are inflicting upon them and convey information on a daily basis on how best to cope with the consequences. As I speak before you today, over 1,000 people remain separated from their families and friends, including hundreds of children. Imagine how every minute of the past 50 days has felt for the parents of these children and the children themselves. In the past 50 days, a dozen residents of Nagorno-Karabakh have passed away, either abroad or in Armenia. Families and friends have been unable to mourn them, since their bodies cannot be transported across the blockade. The transfer of the critically ill still takes place only after negotiations with the Azerbaijani so-called protesters, conducted by the peacekeepers or the ICRC. The so-called protesters truly hold power over the life and death of these individuals. Chemotherapy, provided in cancer clinics across the border, has become impossible to obtain, meaning that patients have been without treatments for 7 weeks now, their chances of recovering from cancer slowly dissipating. By now, hundreds of planned surgeries have been indefinitely suspended. Hospital wards cannot be heated sufficiently to meet the bare minimum safe temperature of 14 degrees Celsius. There are serious shortages in essential foodstuff and medicine, with the small quantities allowed to pass being distributed to the most vulnerable and not even coming close to the needs of the broader population. And it is the same with baby formula. The flow of gas was restored on the eve of this hearing. It remains to be seen for how long. Rolling electricity blackouts remain necessary to sustain the viability of the electricity network. Instead of attending school, thousands of children sit at home without electricity for 6 hours a day, with an empty pantry, and some of them with the heat of only a wood-burning stove. The impact of all this on their development is too obvious to state. Virtually all economic activity has been suspended. The closure of the highway has made the import and export of products and materials impossible, causing the shutdown of commercial and manufacturing businesses. At least 5,000 have lost their jobs. Despite international calls, humanitarian organizations and United Nations agencies still cannot reach the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, any suggestion that this situation can be addressed through the trickle of supplies that is allowed to go in is cynical. The same is true of any suggestion that emergency and routine medical care of 102,000 people should be contingent on negotiated ICRC transfers as if in a time of war. Nothing short of a full lifting of the blockade and unhindered resumption of the provision of public utilities will bring relief to the victims of this unnecessary and cruel blockade. And in this conclusion, Armenia is not alone. This conclusion is shared by the international community at large. As you can see on your screens, calls abound for Azerbaijan to immediately and fully end the blockade and to urgently guarantee unimpeded access. This is necessary in order to avert humanitarian catastrophe, the risk of which grows each day. Following Azerbaijan's failure to respect the interim measure ordered by the European Court of Human Rights, the President of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe similarly expressed her, quote, concern about the increasingly precarious humanitarian situation, end quote, of the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, and, quote, called on the relevant authorities to quickly restore freedom of movement along the corridor in order to avoid the further deterioration of the situation. And yet we heard from Mr. Martin that such calls fall on willfully deaf ears. Azerbaijan brags openly about how it cannot be stopped, not by the international community, and not even by a binding order of the court in Strasbourg. Madam President, distinguished judges of the court, the progressive deterioration of the situation is obvious, as is the collective trauma already inflicted on the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. With respect, these circumstances do not just entail an imminent risk of irreparable harm. They are causing such irreparable harm in real time, with the scope, scale, and gravity of the harm compounding with each passing hour. The court has previously granted provisional measures to protect rights under the CERD after finding that the affected populations remain vulnerable. The people of Nagorno-Karabakh are not just vulnerable, they are enduring for 50 days now a humanitarian crisis, and I'm afraid they will continue to do so without the court's urgent intervention. This concludes my presentation. I thank the court for its attention and respectfully request, Madam President, to ask Professor Darzand to take the floor.